Hero, have you ever wondered whether human beings are inherently good or inherently bad? Have you asked yourself, if I sometimes do things that are, let's say, against my self-interest or harm people that I care about, was I born this way? And what is the deal with this thing I've heard about called original sin? Is that a Jewish thing or not? We're going to address all of these questions in the Jew Curious show today, right after this bass. Welcome, everybody, to the live studio broadcast of the Jew Curious Show podcast. We're recording a little show today inspired by yesterday's discussion. So this is happening in real time, y'all. We had a great discussion yesterday about Mashiach or Messiah, and it inspired me to get into, let's say, the Jewish version or the Jewish alternative to the Christian concept of original sin. And this is people wonder, am I doing bad because some external force is tempting me? Was I born with wickedness that has to be expiated somehow? What's the deal? Sometimes I try to do good, but it doesn't always work out that way. Is this inherent to the human condition? And what might Judaism say about all of these things? So we're going to talk about that today. I wanted to go ahead and record the promo just to kind of get that out of the way. Just shake it off, have a little bit of rocket fuel here. Then I want to give some shout outs to the people who are in the live chat. First, we're going to take a little sample of silence. So we're going to count to 10. And if you're just joining us for the first time, this might not be the kind of YouTube video you're used to. Or if you've watched some of my shorter videos, this is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be here for about an hour-ish, 45 minutes, 15 over, something, give or take. As long as the discussion takes, as long as people have great questions about this topic, or even, okay questions about this topic. That's what I'm here to do. So settle in, relax. We're going to be here for a while. And because this is a recording for a podcast later, I do some things like use my radio announcer voice sometimes. And I like to take a little sound print of silence while my air conditioner is on so I can edit that out of the podcast later. So here we go. I'm going to count to 10 silently. I know that's the most boring thing I could do on a live video, but here we go. All right. Mission accomplished. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and the Hadar Ensemble, for your inspiring opening beats. And thank you to everybody who has joined us in our live studio recording for this Jew Curious Show podcast. Most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the podcast on your phone, in your car, on your favorite podcast listening device. While we've got access to that advice, let me just ask a favor, but really I hope I'm doing you a favor. What you should do is tap the subscribe button on your podcast listening device, or say to your smart speaker, please subscribe to this podcast, because that's going to save you a lot of work later. If you like the learning that we do together and you're subscribed, you'll get access to everything in our archive, 30 plus shows at this point. Plus, when we have a new episode, you will auto-magically download it into your device. It's as if you have a team of IT-related servants delivering this learning to you. You don't have to lift a finger. You just turn on the device and we start learning together. So wanted to make that recommendation for you. Now I want to shift over and give some love and give some shout outs to the people who have joined us live. We just made Minyan here today. We've got 10 people in the live studio audience, and we'll probably get more as people come in. So I want to give a shout out to Kathy from California, great moderator, leader, somebody who's always very welcoming here in the chat. So if you don't know what's going on, say, hey, Kathy, what's going on? And she can tell you while I'm blathering on about something else. Miriam is here. You're on time today. I'm not surprised one bit. Miriam's from New Hampshire. Carmen's coming in. We've got Karen from Philadelphia, the city of siblingly love. I like to be an egalitarian there. And, of course, Carmen's coming in from Henderson, Nevada. Thank you for reminding me. I forgot that's where you're coming in from. Caleb is here. And Dave B says, hello, everyone. Everyone say hello back to Dave B. Just go ahead and type that in the chat. Hello, Dave B. I see Milo from Denmark. Welcome back, Milo. Good to learn with you. And William, coming in from Waukesha Springs, Florida. We got a good crowd here today to talk about a good topic and possibly an evil topic. Mwahaha. Like Mike Myers says in that movie, So I Married an Axe Murderer, which I probably refer to more than anyone I know. He says, evil, like the fruits of the devil. And we are going to be talking about evil today, and whether that is, something that exists in the world. Is it only the absence of good? Are people inherently evil or have an evil inclination? Is evil an external force like Satan that people talk about sometimes as this separate being that tempts us to do bad things? Is that a Jewish thing? Is it not a Jewish thing? Or is it on us at all times to pick the bad from the good? Let me rephrase that. That's why this is a recording and I get to edit stuff out later. Is it on us? Or is it on us at all times to pick the good instead of the bad? And how does God feel about that when we make the choice that we make? So we'll talk about that more today. Really appreciate everybody joining us here today. I don't know. I'm just gathering wool here for a second. I'm trying to think if I want to ask you guys a question, because you guys ask me questions all the time. So I want to ask you a question, and that is, do you think that evil is something that resides within us, or whether it's something outside of us that we have to deal with? So I'm going to let you scratch your heads on that a second. And if you're in the studio audience, please give me your answers in the chat. And I want to share with you here in just a second the, let's say, mainstream Jewish idea about where evil comes from and what's our responsibility to deal with it. I'm just going to scoot up to my chair a little bit more rocket fuel just to get this going. That's me drinking coffee if you're listening at home or on the go. Caleb says both. Is evil something external or internal? Caleb says yes. Going back to the thumbnail for this YouTube video, are humans inherently good or inherently evil? And some people would say one or the other. I say yes, but I want to hear what you have to say. Kathy shares, a few rabbis go so far as to say we have a higher godly soul and a lower animal soul with evil inclinations. So these are actually two separate souls that reside within us, and we're constantly challenged to, let's say, go with a good soul, go with a godly soul instead of the lower soul. But even the rabbis back in the days of the Talmud said you can't have all good and no evil, and I'll share why here in a second. KG Wilcox shares, my neshama, my soul is pure, but I'm still likely to sin because I lack knowledge and perspective. That is true. I've always found that you can't have good judgment without first having bad judgment. Most wisdom we gain in our life is from, and I'll just say this in I terms. I have found in my own life that most wisdom I have gathered has been learning from unwise decisions. And so I've exercised bad judgment, I've experienced a consequence, and I have learned to exercise better judgment, and that is an ongoing process for me, and I suspect for many of you as well. Carmen's also going with, sometimes it's in me, sometimes it feels like it's outside of me. And Miriam weighs in, probably it has to do if it's intentional or done consciously. And that is another aspect of this. We make mistakes all the time on purpose, and we make mistakes all the time purely by error, purely by ignorance of the consequences of what we're doing, or by accident, just slip and fall and maybe bump into somebody's car when you're trying to pull out of a parking space, things like that. We do things intentionally, we do things unintentionally. Are the consequences different? Sometimes. We were learning in the Torah about different kinds of sacrifices, and we're taught about doing kind of a sin offering or a guilt offering. If you did something wrong, you need to show up and make it right, whether you did the thing on purpose or not. And I think this comes to teach that even when we make mistakes unintentionally, the best way to help us learn to avoid those mistakes in the future is having some sort of consequence that we have to deal with. And this reminds us to maybe structure our lives, even if we didn't intend to do it in the first place, to structure our lives, recondition ourselves, practice what we need to practice in order that we can avoid those same mistakes in the future. Kathy shares, Rabbi, some have a zombie side, haha. So Kathy knows this about me, that I love scary movies, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. It's kind of a guilty pleasure, but I'm going to say hashtag guilty, not guilty. Right? That's maybe it's too jury trial-y. But I'll say I do like scary movies. I like to be scared, and my favorite kind of scary movie has to be zombie movies. So that's on me. I did learn the Hebrew word for zombie is matamtumim. That is zombies. Like matamtumim are like kind of, it's like a golem. It's like an unconscious, destructive creature. And so if you watch zombie movies in Hebrew, they'll probably say, oh no, the matamtumim are coming, except they'll say that in Hebrew, Let's see. Chad asked the question, can you please comment on how to live closer to God, either as a Reform or conservative Jew, without having to be Orthodox? So there are lots of ways to be closer to God, regardless of the denomination that you are in. For many people, that comes through prayer and meditation. For many people, that comes through doing mitzvot, right? The mitzvot that we are offered in the Torah, some would say commanded, because the word mitzvah means commandment. But those commandments that God commands us to do or commands us to refrain from doing are intended to elevate us, whether it's to bring us closer to God or just make us a better version of ourselves. That's what those mitzvot are for. And when we say a blessing before we do a mitzvah, we bless God and we say Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, right? We say we bless God who sanctifies us, sets us apart, elevates us, brings us closer to God by means of God's commandments. And so I say anybody, whether you're Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructing, Renewal, post-denominational, has access to these commandments. And by doing them, by going through these ritual behaviors or ethical behaviors, I'll just speak for myself. Those have made me feel closer to God. And I think that's true for other people as well. Sometimes I've had my gears grinded a little bit when I was explaining some sort of mitzvah, whether it was keeping kosher or behaving a certain way on Shabbat. And somebody said to me, well, Rabbi, we don't do that. That's Orthodox, and we're not Orthodox, so we don't do that. And I said, well, no, that's a mitzvah. That's part of Jewish culture. Now, you may choose to do it or not, but you don't have to be Orthodox in order to do these things. And so I just want to make sure everybody here hears that as well. So thanks for the great question, Chad. When we do right, we can feel closer to God, or we can feel like a truer expression of ourselves as created in the image of God. And so that brings me to our topic of today. Is a person inherently close or inherently distant from God, or both? And sort of rephrased the question, is a person naturally good or naturally evil? And one might define that on a dimension of nearness or distance to God, right? It's a hypothesis. I'm testing it. You let me know what you think. So Kathy asked a great question. I'm going to defer that just a second. Maybe ask it again later. Kathy's asking, do you think Yom Kippur atonement strengthens our good tendencies? Let's answer that a little bit later, just because I want to get into the topic, and then we can reflect on this same thing. So if I don't come back to it, please ask it again. All right. So the reason we're having this conversation today is because of the conversation that we were having yesterday, and we touched on the Christian doctrine of original sin. So I am a rabbi. I am not a pastor or a priest. I'm not a leader in any Christian community. I have some experience being in Christian communities and with Christian family members, and I did pick up a lot, but I'm not speaking for Christian church doctrine right now as an expert on the inside of that institution. But from my observation, the notion is that when Adam and Eve took a bite of the fruit in the Garden of Eden that they were instructed not to, then they became, let's say, polluted by this concept of original sin, meaning they sinned this sin. The first thing God told them not to do, they did it anyway, and we've been making up for that ever since. And there are ways to atone for sins. There's ways to make things right between you and other people that you wrong, or if you wrong or impair your relationship with God, there are ways to make up for that. However, this original sin is indelible and can only be washed away by a relationship with the Christian Messiah. And so what I wanted to do yesterday is give an alternative to that is the Jewish view of that same story, right? The tree that they ate from, according to the Torah, is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And so if you eat that fruit, presumably we didn't have the knowledge between good and evil or right and wrong, and so we didn't have responsibility for that. We just go around naked in the garden, eating any other fruit, and all of our needs are met. But once we take a bite of that fruit and we can see that certain things are good and certain things are bad, we then gain the responsibility to choose the good over the bad. We gain a moral responsibility of how we act in the world, and we gain free will. We get the choice to make in the first place, right? We're encouraged to do good, but it's on us. You know, we get to see what's good and what's bad, and then it's on us to make the right choice. And so many in the rabbinic tradition see this not as an event of impairment, not as an event of, gaining this indelible sin, but as an event of the gift of free will, which I think is possibly, and I like the Torah. Like, the Torah is a pretty good gift. I'm going to say the gift of moral responsibility, of moral intuition, of freedom is possibly the greatest gift that God ever gave to human beings. And what we do with it is on us. God gave us the Torah as like a good, helpful guide when it was clear that we needed one, right? We got to choose between right and wrong. Sometimes it helps to have a guide. And that's what I see the Torah as, is the guide to life for a free people. And so acknowledging that we have this moral responsibility, there's a couple of other places in Genesis, in Sefer Breshit, in the first book of the Torah, that says, Yetzer Lev Hadam. Let's see. I want to look this up just so I don't mess it up. Sometimes I can quote things from memory. Sometimes I can't. Let's see. Yetzer Lev Ha'adam Ra. It was just one more word. I missed that one. Yetzer Lev Ha'adam Ra, meaning the inclination of the human heart is toward evil. And it says this in a couple of different places, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, and again in chapter 8, verse 21. It talks about this in the story of Cain and Abel, right? And it uses phrase like, sin crouches at the door and longs for human attention, right? That is either our inclination toward evil or evil's inclination toward us. And so even though we don't see eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as an implantation of evil in us, we do see that humanity is born with two opposing instincts, let's say. We have what we call the Yetzer HaTov, or the inclination to do good, and we have the Yetzer Hara, the inclination to do evil. And so rather than looking at the event of the tree and the apple and all that stuff as a once and future incarnation of natural human evil, we see even without that a human inclination both to the bad and to the good. And this Yetzer Hara, and evil is like a complicated term. One great explanation that I read was that this evil inclination is actually, let's say, an excessive expression of other natural inclinations, right? Sometimes instead of evil, I call it selfishness or self-interest taken too far, right? We have an inclination to find food, right? That's there's a couple of things all organisms do is they like to eat, they like to metabolize chemicals from their environment in order to sustain their life. That's eating, simply put. And they like to reproduce, right? They like to make copies of themselves. And so our inclination toward eating and reproduction are natural animal inclinations. But when we take them too far, or when we let them, run around unsupervised, the inclination to eat can lend toward gluttony, toward overconsumption, toward destroying the environment that we're trying to survive in, or destroying our bodies through overeating or depriving other people of food. See, that's a natural inclination to eat that then goes off the chain into things that harm ourselves or other people or our natural environment. Likewise, can people see me? What's going on right now? Okay, sorry about that. I don't know how far we got into the chat before it completely cut off. All right, if you can hear me, just say back on, back on. People see me? What's going on right now? Okay, just going to check my stream quality here. This is embarrassing. I hate this when this happens. Okay, back on, back on. Thank you, Carmen. Took me literally. All right, can everyone hear me okay? If you can hear me, say, hear you. Kind of 14-4. Thank you for that. Okay, my computer's acting up a little bit. We may have to re-scrub this and reschedule it. I'm sorry, everybody. I hate it when this happens because I know people schedule and make time for this. So if it's going to be too slow, I think I may just scrub it for the day because I've gotten used to having a faster connection. All right. No, let's keep going. Let's salvage it. Let's see what we can do. I really appreciate everybody who hung out. I know some people bugged off because it failed, but I see some neat people here in the chat. So really Appreciate your being here. So let's just get back into it. So we're talking about evil. I had evil inclination in my equipment, or maybe that was my own evil inclination in not having a faster internet connection. So let's keep going. There will, if I cut this off, I feel like it would be a victory for the Yetzer Hara. So I'm not going to give the Yetzer Hara that satisfaction. So sometimes you might hear it referred to as, let's see, make sure my OBS is up and recording. Give me a little hiccups there. Okay. You could hear me mostly. Keeps cutting out. You're live. Things happen. All right. Really appreciate everybody's kindness on this. This is the kind of the community that I'm really proud has come together through this learning. And so I'm going to keep going. So we were talking about the Yetzer Hara. So let's just trying to figure out where were we when this cut out. I'm going to go back into it, and it might be kind of herky-jerky today. The recording will probably be a little bit better, and so when I get this up into the podcast, God willing, soon, it will sound better. So we're going to prevail over the Yetzer Hara, and I think would I say that Satan is conspiring against us? No, because that's just my personal theology. That's not how Satan works. So let's talk about the Yetzer Hara. So I was telling a story, and don't stop me if you've heard this one, because I don't know if it got recorded or not. There is this. So on the one hand, we've got this. I don't know exactly where to go back to. Let's do it anyway. So some say that the Yetzer Hara isn't necessarily evil in itself, except that it is a lack of restraint on purely natural, human, and I'll say animal impulses that we have to do those things that all living creatures do. And that is eat, consume nutrients from the environment in order to sustain our lives, and also procreate. Right? This is also a very natural thing. However, if you take those sort of amygdala type impulses, those things that reside in your lizard brain, and eat to, let's say, excess, that's bad for your body. It could be bad for the environment. You're overusing resources. It could be bad for other people that you're consuming what other people need to eat or other resources that they need. So the inclination to feed ourselves, while necessary, can come off the chain and lead toward behavior that impairs our relationships with other people, impairs our health, impairs our relationship with God. Likewise, that natural instinct to reproduce, to get close to other folks, and make copies of ourselves in a sexual way, that also can become unrestrained and lead to excess, lead to violence, lead to non-consensual relationships, lead to abuse. And so that, too, is a natural instinct sort of let off the chain. And so our challenge is throughout our lives to balance these two things. And there is a midrash that says, so one might ask the question, why have this evil impulse to begin with? And, it goes back to this need to eat and procreate and do things that help those things out. There's a midrash that says at one point God created the world, but created humanity with only an impulse toward good, created people in God's image, and the people were just kind of walking around being godly, but it didn't work out because they never fed themselves. They had no hunger, right? And which means they didn't work to feed themselves and they wasted away. They didn't farm to provide food for their families because they didn't really feel the need to. The other thing they didn't do is procreate, right? They don't, God doesn't need to procreate necessarily. Why should we? And so they just sort of sat around being holy, but not making copies of themselves, not sustaining the population, not doing the things necessary to feed themselves and one another. They didn't farm. They didn't start businesses. They didn't build houses. They just wasted away into nothingness. And you can ask the Essenes or the Shakers, if you're a human population that doesn't procreate, you don't last very long. And so God decided, okay, I'm going to try this again. I'm going to give them an inclination toward good, make sure they know they're created in my image, but I'm also going to throw a little bit of selfishness in there. I'm going to throw a little bit of this Yetzer Hara. I'm going to give them that amygdala, that lizard brain that makes them want to eat and also have Congress, and so that they will procreate, they will sustain themselves, and that's how this project will keep going. Because the more people you have, the more mitzvahs you can do. The longer you live, the more mitzvahs you can do. And so God gave us this evil inclination, but gave us the means to harness it. So that's so that's our challenge since the days of eating the apple and getting the knowledge of good and evil, right? We have both of these things in us, right? We're really eating a bite of a fruit of self-awareness, if you will, because we could then recognize those of our inclinations that were good and those of our inclinations that were bad, and we get the free will to choose and also the moral responsibility to choose well. Later on in Deuteronomy, it reprises this theme and says, Moses is saying to the people, like, look, God gave us two paths, right? A path of blessing and a path of curses. A path of evil and a path of good, a path of death and a path of life. And then it says in the imperative, the command form, choose life, right? You can choose either, but God wants you to choose good. And I think this is a powerful statement of God's love for us, that we get to choose between good and evil. We're not robots, right? We're not puppets on strings. We get to exercise our own responsibility. But it's also helpful to know that God has an intention for us, has a choice that we should make, should we rise to that occasion. And so I want to go back to this idea that, yes, we are all inherently both godly and selfish. And both of these are necessary to our functioning as fully realized human beings. Our task is then to manage these things, right? And so this is why I reject this notion of, let's say, Hasatan or Satan as being an external force of evil in the world, because I believe all evil that's in the world is a failure of human will to balance to strike the right balance between good and evil. There's not somebody out there who's making us evil. Not a ghost, not a spirit, not a fallen angel. There is some later stuff in the apocryphal literature within the Hebrew, just outside of the Hebrew canon that says, yes, Hasatan is an external force that tempts us. In other religions, this idea is more thoroughly developed, that we are naturally evil, but it's this external force that brings that out of us. And for me, that is sort of relinquishing personal responsibility in a way that I'm not super duper comfortable with. Certainly there are people who can be a bad influence. Certainly there are ideologies that are worse for us than others, that are external to us. But it's really on us to restrain our evil impulse to follow those people, to follow those ideologies, right? Because we only do those things if we think that they're going to help us in some way express our self-interest. And so I put that out there as I'll say, mainstream Jewish view. I'm not going to say Judaism says a single one true thing about just about any subject, because that would be inauthentic to the diversity of the Jewish tradition. But I will say the mainstream view is that each of us has within us both the capacity for godliness and the capacity for extreme selfishness. And our job in this world is to balance those things out. It's not that we can never be selfish or should never be selfish. There's this great teaching from Rabbi Hillel in Pirkei Avot where it says, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Right? We have to stick up for ourselves. We have to protect our own self-interest in order to survive, right? So that we can go on and do good for us, do good for God, do good for our community. But we have to stick up for ourselves. If we don't, who will? But then the very next line of that teaching is, if I am only for myself, what am I? Right? So he recognized that if we are only about eating and having sex and our own comfort and not really concerned about anybody else, is that any different from a wild animal? Right? Am I even a human being? And so I think Rabbi Hillel phrases that well in, let's say, the Mishnaic period of a couple of thousand years ago, that we recognize we have tendencies towards selfishness, we have tendencies towards selflessness and godliness, but we need both, right, in order to survive as human beings. And God didn't create us any other way than that. And so when you look at yourselves, I never want you to look at yourself, and this is just me, caring about you. I never want you to look at yourself as only inherently evil. Do you have selfish tendencies? I hope so, because then if not, I would be totally alone in that, because I know I have selfish tendencies. And sometimes those have served me well, and sometimes they have not. But are you inherently a bad person? I don't believe that anybody is inherently exclusively evil. You can throw examples of me like Mussolini and Hitler or whatever. Were they born that way? Are there people with psychopathologies that make them unable to express good? Yes, there are biological aberrations. We are made out of the stuff of the earth, and sometimes that stuff will break down. But I believe most evil in this world is the hyper expression of the lizard brain unrestrained by moral consciousness. And so I think that explains a lot of the evil that's in the world. People have fear that they won't have enough to eat, that they won't be able to procreate, that they won't be able to sustain their community. When they act out of that fear, sometimes they overact out of that fear to the great detriment of the people around them and themselves. And that is real. I do think evil exists in the world, but I don't think it's an external force that pollutes us and tempts us against our power to fight it. I believe that we all have responsibility to challenge that evil in ourselves and in others. And I know that's a tall order, and I know sometimes it's super scary, but I also want to say we're in this together. And so if you're scared of fighting that evil in the world, know that you have friends, know that you have a community, and you don't have to do anything alone. So with that, I want to make sure my computer's still working, because we had a little frog out later. I'm fighting my evil inclination to use the words that come to mind when I think about technical difficulties on YouTube. So with that, I want to go back into the chat, see what questions people have. Let's see. I want to go back to what one thing that Kathy was asking right in the beginning, and that is about Yom Kippur. So let me see if I can find that. It's going to be right up near the top. Kathy, so I want to go into the chat right now, see what people are asking in the live studio audience, and going back up to the top, Kathy says, do you think Yom Kippur atonement strengthens our good tendencies? Yes, I do. And not just Yom Kippur atonement, just to be clear, the kind of tshuva that we make, the kind of atonement that we do on Yom Kippur, that's kind of like the Super Bowl of atonement, if you will. That's like the big event of the day. But I want to make a couple of very important points about that. One is that, according to Maimonides, Yom Kippur is a day of atonement between you and God, right? If you have sinned against God, and this is things like, breaking the mitzvot that don't necessarily impact other people, breaking elements of the covenant. I didn't keep Shabbat as well as I could have. I had a ham and cheese sandwich here and there. These don't have, let's say, victims outside of the relationship between you and God. That's what Yom Kippur is for. When you fast and pray on Yom Kippur and make tzedakah on that occasion, that is there to repair the relationship between you and God. However, Rambam Maimonides goes to great pains to say that doesn't repair relationships that may have been broken with people. So anything you did to another person, Yom Kippur doesn't atone for that until you have made it right with that person, right? To the extent that, let's say I harmed or wronged somebody else, one could say that I also harmed God in that moment. Let's say I punched a guy in the nose because I was angry about something. I didn't. I think I've yet to ever punch anybody in the nose. So, yay me. I'm not bragging. Just never had the occasion. But let's say, for example, I punched somebody in the nose. That isn't just a violation against that person. That is also a violation against God because I have punched in the nose somebody created in the image of God. And so, if it was just to God, Yom Kippur could atone for that. If it was just to the person, then maybe just making it right with that person, paying for plastic surgery, saying I'm sorry, getting some anger management therapy to make sure I don't do it again, what have you, that may make it up to that person, but then it requires Yom Kippur to make it up to God. But Yom Kippur won't make it up with God until you've made it right with that person. That's how Maimonides says Yom Kippur atonement works. But I'll say that kind of focus on an intense day of focus on atonement, if it works, can have a powerful impact on you throughout the year, right? It brings some, it's at least one check-in every year to say, I can be a better person than I've been. And God willing, that effect lasts to the day after Yom Kippur and the day after that and the day after that. So yes, intense focus on Yom Kippur can bring to mind those ways in which you'd like to improve yourself in the coming year before the next Yom Kippur. So yes, it can help. But like I said before, Yom Kippur is the Super Bowl of atonement, and you don't get to the Super Bowl without winning a bunch of other games first. And you don't get to win those games without a lot of practice and gym time and proper nutrition. Maybe I'm hyperextending this metaphor. But this is something you get to do throughout the year. Yes, that intense day of focusing on atonement can help, but it helps best when it influences you to proper behavior throughout the year, not just waiting for the next Yom Kippur. So yes, I think it can strengthen those good tendencies and then help overwhelm those less good tendencies. I hope that answers your question. Let's see. William shares his thought. I can every day decide to choose the good or evil inclination that has components of selfish behavior, egotistical expressions, or just low-quality decision-making. Yes, William, the choice is ours. Miriam asks, what's the consequence of being mainly good or evil concerning the world to come? So we've talked a little bit about Jewish ideas of afterlife. One is this notion of Olam Haba, or the world to come. This is sort of a next era in Jewish thought, sort of post-apocalypse, and apocalypse in the technical term of kind of an end of an era, the beginning of a new one. There's a mainstream thought within Judaism that says, everybody gets to go to Olam Haba, or most people get to appreciate the world to come. However, your, let's say, share in the world to come depends on how you live your life in this world. And so, like I said, just about everybody gets there. There's some rabbinic teachings about, okay, certain types of people don't get to go. Just about everybody else does. Some people may have, let's say, a bit of a waiting period. We don't have an eternal hell per se. We do have a kind of purgatory. This notion that the soul of somebody who had some unaccounted for, let's say, caving into the evil inclination, they're not quite ready for Olam Haba. They need to spend a little time atoning for that. and this is sometimes called Gehinom, sometimes called Kafakela, different labels for it in our history. But the notion is that a person will spend a period in a kind of purgative process and then will go on to Olam Haba. And so on the one hand, your behavior in this world, whether you are mainly good or mainly evil, I think all of us are a bit of a mix in there. I don't, there's very few people who are purely one or purely the other throughout human history. But you might go right away into Olam Haba, or you might have a bit of a waiting period while you account for those things that you left unaccounted for in your earthly life. And so, but the good news is, like I said, in Jewish thought, this is not an eternity in a lake of hellfire or what have you. Maximum, according to the rabbis, 12 months. The most time your soul will spend in purgatory. Excuse me. The most time your soul will spend in purgatory is 12 months. This is why this is why in Jewish mourning practices, when we lose our parents, we say Kaddish for 11 months. On the one hand, it's thought that when we say Kaddish for the soul of the departed, we are helping hasten them through that purgatory process, which is at most 12 months. However, we don't want other people to think that we think our parents are 12-month people, right? And so we say Kaddish for 11 months to really, do our level best to help them through this process, but not assume that they deserve the 12-month sentence. And so that's why I was taught by my rabbis, we say Kaddish for a parent for 11 months and not 12 or some other number. Miriam asks, I think rhetorically, but I'll share it. I wonder if there was immediate consequences from being evil, if people would be more good. And if it counts as good, if you're only doing it to be avoided, let me break this down. So Miriam asks a couple of questions. I wonder if there was an immediate consequence for being evil, if people would be more good. One might think that if every time we did something bad, we got punished for it, we wouldn't want to do that bad thing again. I think that's pretty wise. But she also asks another question, which is, if it counts as good, does it count as good if you're only doing it to avoid being punished? So I'll say for the most part, Jewish thought tends less toward thought than it does toward action, meaning we are judged by the quality of our deeds, not the quality of our thoughts or intentions behind those deeds. In one teaching, Maimonides shares that it's actually, in some ways, better to do something because you're commanded to, not because you're naturally inclined to. Right? If you're doing something that if you're fulfilling a commandment from the Torah begrudgingly, in some ways that's better, because it's like, I wouldn't do this, but because I love God so much, because I have so much regard for the Torah, I'm going to do this anyway. And that's actually a higher hurdle to overcome. So in some senses, that the intentionality aspect works in the opposite direction. That doesn't mean that we never consider intention. We've learned about from the first chapter of Leviticus, if somebody sacrifices a bull or sacrifices a bird or sacrifices a pile of flour, each of these things having a different price tag and investment on them, these are accepted by God the same if our heart is directed toward heaven, right? So having that good intention can mean that the actions that you take all have the same quality and magnification, whether you do a little or do a lot. And so I'm not going to say intention never matters. Right? There's other places where in Jewish law that the consequence of breaking a law is different if you do it on purpose or by accident. For the most part, if you do it by accident, you're still liable, but the punishment is less severe. There should be some sort of consequence so that you could learn to do better in the future, but intentionality is taken into account. So I think that it doesn't, action matters more, but intention doesn't never matter, if that makes any kind of sense. So I'm just taking a look at some more questions here. Reading through the broken feed comments back on. I love Kathy's sum up of the world to come. I don't think there's an official consensus on the afterlife, re good and bad behavior. We all get a place in the world to come, but maybe good people get better seats. Thank you that's another point that I wanted to make. Once we're in the world to come, even after we've been through kind of the purgative process, it says some people get a better share than others. And we were doing another learning here, I think last week, about why do good people suffer? And there is a strain in rabbinic thought that says sometimes people suffer in this world more than they deserve because God wants to give them a bigger share in the world to come. Some people find that very hopeful. Some people find that very unsatisfying, including some rabbis, including this rabbi. However, there is a notion that if you suffer in this world more than you deserve, you do get, as K.G. Wilcox says, better seats, maybe a bigger house or something like that. Bigger, shorter buffet line. I don't know. Let's see. Getting back to looking for questions, not comments on my 14.4 kilobaud modem that I seem to be running off of today. Looking for things with question marks. So Carmen's sharing something really powerful with us this morning that I want to highlight, saying that her dog was attacked. However, she says, I chose not to accept the offer from the owner. My reasoning, they had done that previously. And so if she had accepted the offer of amends from the owner, knowing that the owner didn't learn the first time, would this be sort of unnecessarily forgiving away? Would they learn their lesson from this? And Carmen asks, is it evil inclination by not accepting the offer? By the owner's admission, nothing registered in terms of consequence. And so this is a question that I get a lot around Yom Kippur, especially when we talk both about atonement, but also about forgiveness. Is forgiveness a responsibility of ours? And I know I mentioned this guy's name a lot, but I've learned a lot from him, even though he's been dead for approximately 1,000 years. And I'll go back to the Rambam, to Maimonides, who lays out in the Mishnah Torah the kind of rules of the road when it comes to asking for forgiveness and granting forgiveness. And it says, if you have wronged a person, you should first go and ask their forgiveness and see if there's something you can do to atone. But they may reject you. Right. And it's a natural tendency when you're mad at somebody. If you don't feel like they're sincere, or you want to, teach them a lesson, and maybe we'll come back to that in a second, you might reject them. And so Maimonides says, then that person who wronged you is responsible to come back again, only with witnesses. And, make the same offer, make the same apology and offer for atonement, and you may reject them again. Right? Maybe you're not ready to forgive. Then that person is required to come back again, a third time. Right? And Maimonides says, at that point, after 3 times and in public, that is the extent of a person's responsibility to make amends. And Maimonides says about the person who never forgives, even after this public display of atonement, then the responsibility shifts to that person who doesn't forgive, and says that this can be an exhibit of cruelty, right? And I get it. There are some things that people have done to us that feel unforgivable. And we also have an inclination to say, like, look, if I don't believe they're sincere, they may be apologizing now, but if I forgive them, I'm somehow accepting their behavior as something that's acceptable in the world, and maybe they won't learn, and they're going to come back and hurt me again or hurt somebody else. And, that may be true, right? Maimonides also says we're only really required to accept sincere atonement, right? And if we don't feel it's sincere, then maybe they haven't used up one of their 3 chances after all. If they're just saying, "Oh, I'm sorry you feel that way," or something like that. But I do learn from Maimonides' shift of calling a person who doesn't ever forgive cruel, that there's something valuable to forgiving somebody even when you don't think they deserve it, right? First off, I want to address the issue of teaching somebody a lesson by not forgiving them. And I'm reminded of a story that Seth Godin tells about, somebody reaching out and touching fire, right? And getting burned. And they pull their hand back and say, "Oh, that's terrible." Well, I'm going to teach that fire a lesson. I'm going to put my hand in again and dare that fire to burn me again, right? And he says, you don't teach fire a lesson. Fire doesn't change being hot. And for some people, they may be wired in a way that they're not going to change. Like if you interact with them in the same way over and over again, their response is always going to be the same, right? And you can't teach them a lesson by not forgiving them, right? But that forgiveness isn't just for them, it's for you, right? It is basically evicting them from that real estate they occupy in your mind of carrying around that grudge, right? It's like letting go of a bag of bricks that you didn't need to carry anyway. So sometimes forgiveness isn't about them, it's about you. Now, you can forgive someone and still change the nature of your relationship with them, that you don't interact with them anymore, right? You can be forgiving and still not talk to them after that. Or still, you can forgive them and still write a vicious animal report to the police or whatever. And so I won't say that it's evil necessarily to not forgive, but it is selfish to the point of self-harm, right? We go back to this definition of the evil inclination as a natural human tendency taken to extremes. This notion of self-preservation then can become revenge. And that doesn't help anybody. I don't think this was a Jewish saying, but it should be, holding a grudge against somebody is like drinking poison, hoping that it will make them sick, right? You're only really harming yourself. And so I encourage people to be as forgiving as they can be on that point, but also on the point that if somebody is sincerely trying to make amends, forgiving them turns you into what's called a shaliach mitzvah, meaning you are helping them do a mitzvah, and that that counts for a mitzvah for you as well. So I know that's very contrary to human tendencies of staying angry at people, and I do that too. But I wanted to give some Jewish thought behind that in case it's helpful for people who are working on forgiveness. I work on this stuff all the time as well. I'm not a saint. I've got the same inclinations, but these kinds of learning around the high holidays, especially every year, helps me, I think, improve gradually, I hope. Miriam asks, hold on a second. Miriam asks, if you saw a crime being committed and don't report it, and that person commits another crime, are you accountable? There's a passage in the Torah that talks about tochacha, or rebuke. If you see something, say something, right? If you see your fellow going to sin, you have a responsibility to correct them. Otherwise, that future sin accrues to you as well, right? If you have the capacity to stop someone from doing something evil and you don't, you do bear responsibility for that action. Now, there's some asterisks on that in a sense. It says you should warn them, you should rebuke them. The rabbis say, okay, this means a verbal warning, meaning they should be able to hear you. And so you don't whisper it. You don't shout it across the street where they might not hear you. You have to approach them, preferably in private, so you don't embarrass them in public, which might exacerbate the condition. But there's another interpretation of what it means for them to be able to hear you. You might not necessarily be the right person to tell them, right? Like you may have a relationship, they're mad at you, you're mad at them or something, or they don't respect you or something, where if they hear it from you, that's not going to change their behavior. Then you might have responsibility for finding another person whom they respect to tell them. But certainly, if you can tell them privately and they don't listen, and you can prevent harm from coming to another person, you should absolutely report them to the authorities or find some way to keep them from doing that thing. So always the first step is one-on-one if you can, if it's safe for you to do that, if you think they'll hear you and process that. But if not, you do have a responsibility for your fellow human beings as well. Val shares, I have an addict in the family moving through her 12 steps, and it was extremely difficult to forgive her for the hurts. Seeing it as helping with a mitzvah makes it palatable, and I feel that way too. And I'm glad you were able to share that with us. Yeah, it's sometimes that forgiveness isn't about them; it can be about you, but you can also help them in a way because if people go through life feeling unforgiven, they may internalize that bad behavior that they're trying to correct into a bad identity, right? We are not inherently exclusively evil people, even if our actions are exclusively evil, right? The problem is when we identify bad actions with bad identity, we feel powerless to change our actions. And for people looking to overcome evil inclinations, large and small, I've read a couple of books recently that I'll recommend. One is Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit. In a more recent text and with more practical step-by-step, something called Atomic Habits by James Clear. That was the name of the author, who talks about, we do certain things out of habit because we attribute them to our identity. And one way to change a harmful habit is to change our sense of identity. And a great example he gives, and I give this as a former smoker myself, let's say you're trying to quit smoking. If someone offers you a cigarette, you may say, oh, no, thank you, I'm trying to quit. Which is different if you say, and it's different if you instead say, no, thank you, I'm not a smoker. Or you could say, I'm not a smoker anymore, right? If you see the difference between these two things, one has shifted their identity to that of a non-smoker, and as a non-smoker, I don't smoke. But the other person who says, I'm trying to quit, they still see themselves as a smoker, and so smoking is part of their identity, which makes it a little bit harder to quit. And I know that's a little bit contrary to the 12 steps model, where people recognize themselves as addicts eternally, in order to break the habit in a different way. But those are just a couple of different ways of thinking about it. Edith asks what I believe is also a rhetorical question. Is it evil inclination when you don't believe to give your children vaccines and create an outbreak and you would not change your mind about it? So I'm not a doctor. I do have very strong feelings that people should vaccinate themselves and others within their care. And I think it's an evil inclination to resist something that could help out your community. So, and then again, that's on the one hand, I guess I believe that people who are refraining from vaccinations are trying to protect themselves from the dangers that they perceive in vaccinations. However, I'm also a strong believer in science and public health, and I think we've proven pretty well beyond a shadow of a doubt through the wisdom and reason and understanding that God has given us that vaccinating people saves lives. It saves the lives in your community far more than what little has been proven about the harms of vaccinations, if any. So I'll answer your rhetorical question with my rhetorical answer. Get vaccinated, y'all. Vaccinate your children, and if you don't blame God for it, or don't bring religious beliefs into it, because I think that's a Hilul Hashem. I think if you can save others' lives and you don't, invoking God in that bad decision is taking God's name in vain. And I'll just put my stake in the ground on that right now. And I'm also, it also grinds my gears to turn on the Today Show, and they keep calling out the Hasidic communities in, let's say, Brooklyn, New York, which is a tightly, densely populated area full of people who are choosing not to vaccinate and blaming their religion for it. It makes all of us look bad. So I'll say, hey, Today Show, stop dumping on us. But hey, people who are in these insular communities, stop making us look bad. So there, I'll say it right now. I may get some unsubscribes and dislikes for that, but that's okay. I'll live. All right, everybody, we've been going for about an hour 15 now, and in just a minute, I'm going to get on a phone call with a great rabbi that I know, Rabbi Sarah Tassman, whom I am interviewing for a future episode of the Jew Curious Show. So I'm going to sign off pretty quick. Watch the skies later today. I'll post on my YouTube channel what is going to be tomorrow's video. I think it's going to be about Passover. I think we've got our Parshat HaShavua on Friday. We've got an Ask Me Anything on Monday. But I think for tomorrow and for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week, we're going to focus on areas of Passover. So what I may start with is a Passover Ask Me Anything tomorrow. Ask Me Anything, Passover edition. That's okay, making that decision right now. Tomorrow's broadcast at 9 a.m. is going to be Ask Me Anything you want to ask about Passover. And then based on that, I'll make specific talks about Passover for next week's shows, because I have to, because it's Passover, right? The Shulchan Aruch says the first rule of Passover is you have to start studying about Passover 30 days before Passover, because there's a lot to it. So bring your questions about Passover tomorrow. I'll answer off-topic questions as well. But let's talk about Passover tomorrow at 9 a.m. here on this YouTube channel, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out through my computer glitches today. Really feel proud of this community that we've built, and so excited to talk to you again tomorrow, and grateful to have learned with you today. I'm going to do just a quick announcery thing to record this for the podcast. We're going to wrap up today's discussion, but I really want to express my heartfelt gratitude to members of the live studio audience who have weighed in with great questions, great comments, some personal stories about people fighting the Yetzer Hara and strengthening the Yetzer HaTov. Most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to this episode of the Jew Curious Show. If you would like to connect with other Jew Curious people just like you, I highly recommend you check out the Jew Curious Community Center. This is a lovingly tended, carefully protected, troll-free Facebook community, private Facebook community that you can access by going to jewcurious.show/JCC. Again, that's jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. Go to that web address I gave you, sign up, and you'll get instructions on how to join this growing community of Jew Curious people just like you. And until next time, Hero, peace. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Really excited to learn with you, as always. Really grateful for how supportive you are of each other, and also how supportive you are of me when my microphones and whatnot breaks down. So until tomorrow, everybody, thanks for hanging out, and peace.